made a rash decision before? You know, the kind of decision where perhaps it's just a little too quick, not quite thought out well enough, when later, maybe only a short time later, you're kind of wondering why in the world I ever made that decision. Like maybe that decision to go bungee jumping. You know, you're peering off the edge and there's a rubber band tied to your leg, and just as you seem to leave the ledge, you're thinking, is this really the best use of my time? People make rash or hasty decisions just all the time. I read, you remember not too long ago, we were in that gas crisis where, prices were going through the roof and it was up about $4 a gallon. I remember hearing this story. There was this guy who was siphoning gas about 2 a.m. in the morning. And it was dark out, of course, 2 a.m. in the morning, so he flicked his lighter on just to get a little illumination as he's siphoning gas. That's not a good idea, all right, in case you don't know that. I think a lot of celebrity marriages could be categorized as rash decisions. Now, this might be a little bit before many of your times, but about a year ago, Carmen Electra came out with this kind of tell-all about her marriage to Dennis Rodman. Now, the marriage happened 15 years ago, but she just came out with this like last year. But their marriage, in case you don't remember this, was about 9 days. I would call that a rash decision, right? A little bit hasty. So this morning we want to look at the decisions that we make about following Jesus. Some people make a rash decision to follow Jesus, and others perhaps are more well thought out. Now, you might remember that a couple of weeks ago we started talking about the Gospel of Mark, and I said that the Gospel writers paint various portraits of Jesus, and they tell stories in that way. And it's important to notice not only what each writer includes, but also what they leave out, and the order in which they tell their tale. So I want you to pay attention to that this morning. I want you to look at only what Mark tells us, and I don't want you to try and bring in stuff from Matthew or Luke or John. This is Mark's story, and we want to see the effect of Mark's story as he tells this tale. So we're going to be here, as I said, in chapter 1, verses 16 through 45. Notice what happens. We saw last time we ended with Jesus proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. And now we're going to see a day in the life of Jesus. It's a sequence of stories that begin, and then they're centered kind of around Capernaum. And we're going to look at each of these 5 scenes individually, and then we're going to talk about them as a whole, and we're supposed to gather from them. So let's look at scene 1, here beginning in verse 16. The scene opens with Jesus walking by the Sea of Galilee. Now, Galilee is far to the north of the capital city of Jerusalem. This is Hickville. This is out far away in the rural countryside. And one of the primary industries here is fishing. Now, Jesus was raised about 20 miles away from the Sea of Galilee. And I think we have a map there that you can see, kind of orient yourself a little bit. On the next slide, maybe not. I don't know. But he spends a lot of his time in his ministry around this lake. So you can see the Lake Capernaum, and Nazareth is about 20 miles away there. And he has a special affinity for this town of Capernaum. That's where Peter is from. And Mark's account is brief and to the point. And if you're looking at the text, you can see this. As Jesus walks along, he sees 2 men, Simon and Andrew, casting a net into the sea. Now, in case we couldn't figure this out on our own, Mark tells us they were fishermen. That's why they're casting the net in the sea. And Jesus calls them and he says, "Come follow me." Now, amazingly, and here's the strange part, you have to recognize it as strange. Without a word, without a question, without even a "who are you?" Simon and Andrew leave their nets and follow. Now, that should seem odd. Now, this definitely might qualify as a rash decision. Hasty, at least, I would say. You might think, well, it's just a fluke. Jesus happened to run upon the 2 most bored fishermen on the planet who had nothing better to do. But look what happens next, if you're following in the text. Just a little ways down the shore, he sees 2 other brothers who are mending their nets, and they're working with their father and the hired hands, and Jesus calls them too. And lo and behold, guess what happens? They leave the boat and they follow. And the only reason that this might not strike us as strange is because it's so familiar. We know the story, and we're like, oh yeah, that's what they do. Now, I remember as a kid running across these scenes and trying to figure it out, wondering why in the world these 4 guys leave everything and follow Jesus. You know, as a kid, it was still new to me, and it was kind of, I recognized it as strange. They don't know who he is. Now, we might argue historically that before this scene, they had heard things about Jesus, they had encountered him on other occasions, and all that kind of stuff. Historically, that's true. And if we were in Luke's gospel, that would also be true. But we're in Mark, and we need to see the story the way Mark wants us to see the story. So we need to listen. He doesn't tell us any of the backstory. He has put the call of the disciples before any of the miracles. In this story, nothing has happened yet. Jesus has been baptized. He was out in the wilderness being tempted. He's just come back, and boom, the call of the disciples. So I had this theory, and you can see it in this picture here. It was the halo theory, or technically that's actually a glowing nimbus, the round thing around Jesus' head. I said in my mind, all right, Peter and Andrew saw the glowing nimbus of Jesus and recognized, here is the divine Son of God that we've been expecting all of our lives. Let's follow him. But you might remember, we've already talked about that the Jews were not expecting any kind of divine figure. That wasn't their Messiah. And there is no glowing nimbus around Jesus, except in the pictures. Right? So why did they follow? Perhaps the fishing was bad. Maybe they were bored. Could be that James and John were ticked off at their dad and we're going to go someplace else. But Mark doesn't let us go there either. His depiction of the call allows for no other answer than this. They follow because it's Jesus who calls. And Jesus has an authority about him. He calls them to a higher purpose than simply catching fish. He says, from now on, you're going to be catching people. And in Mark's gospel, when Jesus calls, disciples follow. That's simply what they do. That's what makes them disciples, is that they follow Jesus. But as we'll see, they're not the only ones who follow. There's going to be crowds that come. Which brings us to the second scene, scene 2, an exorcism in the synagogue. The second scene shifts to a synagogue in Capernaum, and I've got a picture of the remains of a synagogue. This is actually the 4th century synagogue, but it's built right on top of the 1st century synagogue of Jesus. In fact, they have a little place dug out in the floor where you can go look at it and say, that's the synagogue that Jesus was in. It's the Sabbath, and Jesus is a teacher, of course, and everyone is amazed at his teaching because it says he was speaking with authority and not with as the scribes did. Now you might be wondering, what in the world does that mean? We're not exactly sure, but if you look at any of the Jewish literature from that time frame, say the Mishnah or the Talmud, you get a pretty good idea. Because the way this literature works is they're always in debate about points of the law. And the way they do it is they always cite other authorities. That this is what this text means according to, and they say this is what Rabbi Eliezer says, or Rabbi Kahana says, and it's always footnoted, compiling as many authorities as they can to point to their particular position. But Jesus speaks his own word. There's no footnotes. He's simply expressing the message of the kingdom. And he has here an authority that they hadn't heard before. But then right in the middle of his lesson, as he's coming to his best point, his killer illustration, he's rudely interrupted by the presence of a man with an unclean spirit. Now, I always hate it when that happens. Now, just a note, side note here, the phrase unclean spirit is simply a Jewish way of talking about a demon. And we're going to talk more about demon possession later on because there's other demon possession stories in this text, in the story of Mark's Gospel, but just a couple of brief points. First of all, it might surprise you to know that demon possession is not very common at all in the Old Testament. In fact, we only really have one story about demon possession or an evil spirit, and that is the one that comes upon Saul. You might remember, and David plays his harp to soothe him. But if you go back and look at that text, you'll notice that that evil spirit comes from God, and not from Satan or the devil at all. By the New Testament time, demons are mentioned far more frequently, and sometimes they're associated with some specific illness. So here's a demon that has caused blindness in somebody, but other times there's no symptoms given specifically of demon possession. The fact that this guy is in the synagogue would actually be unusual, if he was showing symptoms. So we either have to assume that his symptoms are intermittent, or they're undetected, at least up to this point. So, notice what happens. The demon is immediately on the defensive. He says, "What do you have to do with us?" Verse 24. Now, this is an idiomatic expression. It occurs several times in the Old Testament when someone's feeling threatened. This is the phrase they use. And if we're to try and translate it into our modern lingo, it would be something like this: why are you messing with us? The demon feels threatened, and this is apparent. If you go on and notice this question: have you come to destroy us? This is not an even match. The demon is defeated from the very beginning, and the reason is because he knows who Jesus is, the Holy One of God. He identifies him as such. And in Mark's Gospel, no one seems to know who Jesus is, except, of course, God and the demons. The disciples don't know who he is. The crowds don't know who he is. The religious leaders don't know who he is. Only the demons know. And us, of course, as readers, because Mark told us in verse 1 who he was. Right? But Jesus has no patience with the demon. He immediately orders him to be silent and come out. And then in verse 27 he says, it tells us once again that the people are astounded at his authority. And if you can see the text up there, I know it's a little small, but what I wanted to highlight in red was probably not the best choice of colors. That in verse 22 and then in verse 27, both verses mention the authority of Jesus. That this story opens and closes with that word, and we're supposed to see that, bracketing the text, and that's the message Mark wants us to get. He's not being very subtle, right? Jesus has authority. That's his point. He wants us to recognize that. That his words have power. When he calls people, they come. When he teaches them, they're amazed. When he commands demons, they obey. Jesus has authority. And it's no accident that Mark begins his gospel with this opening miracle being an exorcism. It represents the kingdom's direct attack against the forces of evil. And Mark will often, as he goes through this, connect the proclamation of the kingdom and the attack on evil, exorcism stories. Because as the kingdom advances, evil itself is diminished. All right, scene 3. Lunch at Peter's house. Now, the third scene describes a familiar phenomenon, something we're going to do right after service. We're going to eat lunch. You know, people go out to the cafeteria, people go to grandma's house, whatever it might be. They did it in the first century as well. Right? So they're going to go home. They invite Jesus over to Peter's house after synagogue service for lunch. But there's a problem. Simon's mother-in-law is sick with fever, so they speak a word. They say, Jesus, you know, we had it all planned out, biscuits and gravy, a little fried okra, some fried chicken. It's not happening. Mother-in-law is sick. Jesus says, I'll take care of this. Goes up and heals her. And you think I'm making this all up, but notice what happens. Right after she's healed, guess what she does? She gets up and she serves her. Right? So Jesus said, you know, I got lunch. No problem. We'll take care of it. So they're at Peter's house. By the way, this is what they think to be Peter's house. You can't see it very well because it's underneath the church. They built a church right on top of it. But this is a house from Capernaum that has been identified as Peter's house. It's not very big, but that's Peter's house. Probably. So that's where we're at. So we're there eating lunch. Now, watch what happens. So they eat lunch. That evening, when the sun goes down, the Jews come out of the woodwork and they're bringing all of their sick and all of their demon-possessed to Jesus. Now, they had to wait till sundown. Why? Because it was Sabbath and you can't carry anybody until sundown. So they're waiting, right? You can almost imagine. They're looking out their windows. They're waiting for the sun to break down beyond the horizon. And as soon as it does, they're rushing out, coming to Jesus with all their sick. And so here they are. They're coming. But why are they coming? I don't think it's that hard to guess. After that display in the synagogue, everyone within earshot who heard the story, who has anything from a hangnail to a hernia, is coming to Jesus, coming to the healer. After all, when you have that kind of power at your disposal, you're going to take advantage of it. Jesus is like an ancient superhero. No matter what disaster strikes, he can take care of it. He has swooped into town, vanquishing demons and disease right and left. Who wouldn't want to follow him? It's Jesus with the big cross on his chest. Right? Superhero Jesus. But Jesus needs his own time away, so that takes us to scene 4. He slips away to pray. Even before dawn breaks, he's leaving the house and he's going away to a deserted place to pray. And I think this is, for us, a glimpse of his humanity, that here he is, he still needs time with the Father. He needs time to share and to commune and to recharge and perhaps even to remember what his mission is, because it's easy to get distracted. But soon the peace is threatened shattered because Peter comes along, Simon Peter comes along and says, hey, everybody's searching for you. Now why? Why is everyone searching for Jesus? Why are they pursuing Jesus? And the answer doesn't seem hard to find. There's always more people to heal and more people in need of help. A superhero's job is never done. Yet Jesus doesn't seem particularly excited about returning on into the town. He says, we got to go elsewhere. For I have a message to proclaim. That's why I came. And so the scene in Capernaum is then going to be repeated again and again and again in other towns and in other villages along the way. Now that brings us to our final scene, scene 5. The healing of a leper. Now, in this final scene, Jesus encounters a man with leprosy. Now we've got to be careful of this because leprosy in the Bible refers to a variety of skin diseases, and it's not really anything like what we experience in our modern day setting, which is unfortunate because I heard some great sermons when I was growing up about how horrendous leprosy was. I mean, the preacher would talk about body parts falling off, talk about the guy sleeping one night and the rats come and chew his nose off, and wow, that's cool. I was a kid, right? So that's cool. But that's not what we're talking about. In fact, the true horror of leprosy is not the physical disfigurement that results, it's social isolation. You see, the problem with leprosy is you can't be with anybody. You're kicked out of society. You're isolated from everybody else. Cut off, banned, excluded from everyone else. As if you're dead. Look at Leviticus 13. It says there that a leper shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head be disheveled, cover his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean!" And he shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Yet in this story we see the leper approaching Jesus. This is clearly a violation of the law. He's not supposed to be doing what he's doing. But the man's desperation is driving him. There's no cure for leprosy known. And so this is all he's got, right? He has this bleak prospect of a life lived away from family and friends, but he's heard about Jesus. Word's gotten out after that miracle in the synagogue, and he's coming expressing a great deal of faith. Notice what he says. I know you can make me clean if you want to. And notice his language there. It's not just about healing, it's about purification. And so Jesus, in one instant, heals the man, and simultaneously he breaks the isolation by reaching out and touching the man. A direct symbol of his cleansing. You are healed. You are purified. He then tells him not to tell anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest. Now, the priest is the one that's going to declare him officially clean and allow him to come back into society. But the man can't contain himself. And he goes out and he begins to proclaim, and the message, of course, spreads everywhere. All right, so we have these 5 scenes here at the very beginning of Mark's Gospel. And if we look back on these events, what we see is Mark kind of starting off with this very powerful picture of Jesus. He is a man of power and authority. And Mark begins his Gospel by showing us superhero Jesus. And in some ways, I think it's important for us to see these miracles. I mean, I think we need to know that Jesus is a man of authority, a man of power, a man who can not only understand our troubles, but deal with us and address our fundamental struggles and hardships. But miracles are never enough. Miracles can create an openness to true faith. But miracles can't create true faith. That's not what they're there for. For in the end, it's not his miracles which truly tell us who Jesus is. When we read these stories of miracles, and I remember very clearly as a kid this feeling, you'd see him do all these wonderful things, and you would immediately perceive them as evidence that he is clearly divine, the unique and only Son of God. After all, who else could do such things? It must be Son of God. But the problem is, back in Jesus' day, even though his miracles were unusual, they're actually not unique. You see, there were stories of other figures who walked the landscape and performed healings and exorcism. There's this guy named Apollonius of Tyana. He was a Greek philosopher, a contemporary of Jesus, actually. And there's even a story not only of him doing healings, but also an exorcism. And the story goes something like this. Apollonius was teaching one day about libations, how to pour out drink offerings to the gods, when there is a youth in the back of the crowd that begins to break out in laughter, and everybody thinks he's just being rude and maybe he's drunk. But Apollonius says, no, that's a demon within him. And so he starts staring at this young youth, and the demon then begins to cry out both in fear and rage, like one being tortured. And the demon then promises to leave the young man, and Apollonius commands him not only to leave, but give a sign. And so he says, I'll knock over that statue over there. And so the statue begins to wobble, and then it falls over, and then the crowd is amazed. And then the young man becomes himself again. And the young man takes up the philosopher's cloak and follows after Apollonius. That's a story that was circulating around in this day. A story told about Apollonius. Now we might question its veracity. We might say, well, it didn't really happen. But the point is, people heard that story of Apollonius just like they heard the story of Jesus. And it made them think and it made them wonder, but it didn't make them assume, clearly the unique and only Son of God. See, Jesus' miracles are simply not enough. In fact, miracles sometimes cause us to follow for all the wrong reasons. So once again, I want us to remember that here we have the Gospel of Mark as a portrait of Jesus. And that he is trying to craft a story to help us see something. So what is he trying to help us see? In Mark's story, the crowds function like characters. They flock to Jesus in droves, and the greater the miracles, the greater the crowds. But they're simply there to see the show. That's why they're there. They're there because of what Jesus can do for them, and there's no cost to them. They like the show. However, we must always remember that this story, which begins with the miracles of God, ends with Calvary. And the story that begins with this superhero Jesus begins with the same man hanging on a cross. And the kingdom is not about the end of physical suffering in this life. You see, the crowds are following the superhero. And the moment they perceive weakness, they're going to abandon him, and they're going to turn against him, and they're going to leave him. Yet there's this other group of characters in Mark's story, bringing us all the way back around to the beginning. It's the group we talked about in scene 1, the disciples. Think about that story again. They chose to follow before there were any miracles. They heed his call not knowing what's in it for them. Not knowing that this Jesus is offering anything of value except to show them the way. To make their lives more meaningful. To give them a purpose beyond catching fish. And so, that leads us to a question. Why do we follow Jesus? Why do you follow Jesus? See, the crowds come for the show, but when the show's over, they leave. When they can't get anything more, when they no longer receive something from Jesus, they vanish. But why do we follow? Why do disciples follow? The only reason you follow Jesus, if the only reason you follow Jesus, is so that he can take care of you. What happens when the struggles come, when you face hardships? What happens when you pray and your prayers aren't answered the way that you wanted them to be, the way you wished them to be? What happens when the healing doesn't come? What happens when you feel all alone? Will you still follow Jesus when the hardships are there? If you think that Jesus' message is just defined in terms of physical health and prosperity, you're going to be disappointed. I mean, there have been figures, disciples throughout the ages, some who have been blessed with these things, but many more have never seen them. In fact, they've seen great hardship and struggle. So why follow Jesus? Now it's interesting, I've asked this question actually of a lot of Christians over the years. Why do you follow Jesus? Why should we, I teach classes, well, that's the whole class, why do you follow Jesus? And I'm amazed at how difficult it is for them to come up with an answer. I don't know. That's the way freshmen are supposed to do. I don't know. Yet ultimately the answer usually comes out something like this. They follow because it's Jesus who leads. Jesus knows the way. He knows far better than I what that way is. I've tried my own life. It doesn't work so well. Yet this man, Jesus, knows the path. I might not know where it's going, But I know the one who leads, and I trust him. So I follow, because it's Jesus who calls. Jesus calls us to follow, not simply believe. And following involves far more than coming to church, sitting in a pew, singing songs of praise, listening to sermons. Discipleship is seen in who we become. Perhaps you made a rash decision for Jesus. I don't know. Maybe you did it because everybody else was did it. Maybe it was at camp. Maybe it was a church, revival somewhere. Maybe it was because it was expected of you. Your parents kept waiting. Maybe it was because your friends were doing it, or your parents were nagging, or I don't know. Maybe it was some kind of motivation other than Jesus. But you made this rash decision for Jesus, and for the last 5, 10, 20, 30 years, you've just been keeping up pretense. So maybe you finally need to look at why you follow. Ask the question. Maybe now is the time to reconsider. Maybe you look at Jesus and you find it's all just a sham. And he's not worth following. But maybe, if you look deeply enough at this man Jesus, maybe for the first time, you find not a superhero but a savior. You find somebody who is worth following. So I challenge you to ask yourself, why are you following Jesus? What do you hope to gain? And is it worth it? We're going to come around this table and we're going to take